Hey, why don't we go ahead and get started? It looks like the sign-ins are starting to level out. So hello, everyone. Welcome to Ask the Grant Writing Experts. I'm Dr. Meg Bouvier. You know me as the creator of your library of NIH grantsmanship courses. I have over 35 years of experience at NIH as an applicant, an intramural researcher, a staff writer, and now a full-time NIH grant mentor. I've helped clients land over $500 million in federal funding, and I'm here to answer your NIH grant writing questions. So grab a cup of coffee and let's get started. So if you're attending live, just a reminder that you're in listen-only mode. You can type your questions in the Q&A box. If you scroll down and look at the toolbar, you'll see a Q&A box. Feel free to put questions in there at any time. And if you have comments that you want to make, anything that you want to add to the conversation, feel free to put that in the chat box. And if you are watching this as a recording, just a disclaimer that things change really quickly at NIH, and everything that we say today is true to the best of our knowledge as of August 23rd, 2023. So in terms of what you should be viewing in the library right now, those of you who are applying for the Cycle 3 deadlines in October and November, I would imagine that if you're applying in the R series, you're probably watching Master the R series. You probably made your way through Part 1 preparation and Part 2 specific aims, and are working your way through probably by now about Part 3, which is significance and innovation, and Part 4, which is approach. A reminder about a recent change in NIH policy. In May, NIH, with the change in the state of emergency around the pandemic, they suspended their COVID era policy where they were allowing preliminary data on all grant applications as post-submission material. And instead, they made that a permanent change, policy change. I believe it's to the R01, R21, and R03 mechanisms only. If those specific mechanisms allow post-submission material, you can submit preliminary data as post-submission material on those mechanisms. So let's pause here, and I would like to introduce our guest. So we have back with us today David Widmer. And David is a dear friend and colleague who has visited with us many times, and he has a topic to discuss with us today. So David, I'm going to have you introduce yourself and the topic.
Thanks a lot, Meg, and thanks for having me back. I really enjoy coming to the AG sessions. Like Meg, I started as a scientist. I moved to a grants office and was both a grants manager, ran the grants office for a number of years, and then shifted to research development, which is part of the same field. And a lot of what Meg provides for you is in that research development niche. What I want to talk about today is everything else that goes around your grants. As somebody, let me share my screen. As somebody who was a grants manager, I was trying to think of all of the, hold on a second. Let's put this up. I was trying to think of all of the uh, offices that, no, sorry. There we go. Trying to think of all of the offices that uh, come up when it's a deadline day. It's 4:55. Your grant is due, and you've got everything put together because you've been working with Meg for months and months. But did you know that you really should contact some of these other offices? So that's what I want to share with you today. Um, you will have seen this in one of the blogs that's been posted on Meg's site. So there's much more details in there. But I tried to pull out from my experience what offices and contacts you may not know about yet. It's the end of August. Finish out the summer, enjoy your Labor Day, but when you come back in September, make sure you know the processes in your institution and have checked who are your contacts in your offices for a number of these items. So the most important thing is that a PI does not submit a grant directly to NIH. It's submitted by your institution. So who is that person? Is it a central grants office that does that? Is there a departmental one? What about the signatories? There's an institutional signatory when they press that button and send your grant forward to grants.gov, but do you need a sign off from a department chair? Do you need the vice president of research to take a look at it? Because those things don't just take a few minutes. Everyone else is submitting at the same time you are. And then please also be aware, especially these days, as NIH is becoming more and more focused on compliance, research subjects, transparency, rigor, all of those things. Is there a compliance office? When you are submitting, you are attesting that there's no financial conflict of interest. Is there anything you need to do beforehand with a compliance office? There was at institutions that I was at. Research subjects. What pre-reviews are needed if you are dealing with animal studies? Do you have to alert and or finish a process with IACUC? Similar to human subjects, what aspects of starting a review with the internal review board need to happen before your submission? In the institution where I was at, labs themselves were assessed for biosafety, and so they had like a certificate. Do you need to get that so that that box is checked before your central office will submit your grant? And then two other things that may be in the same office or maybe in different offices. Is there a required review that you are not adding in any intellectual property or technology that your institution may want to submit a patent for? Sometimes, if in material transfer agreement, an MTA will be required, there are pre-submission processes before that. So I wanted to add this as a topic for when I came back to an AGE session, because for those who are submitting for the next cycle, this is the time when you should learn about what other steps go around it. There's too many examples of people coming at 4:55 p.m. Oh, I didn't know I needed this, and this. I know you've been working extremely hard on your science, as you should, but there are people in these offices who will help you to process these things, but they need to know your grant is coming. So this is, my 5-second encouragement to search out the process at your institution and work with the context there.
So, David, I'm just going to pause you there and let people know that you have a blog post that
Yes.
corresponds with this, as you mentioned, and it's the link to that is in the chat, as is contact information for David in his bio, in addition to the slide that's up. So I just want to follow up on a couple of things. And while you were talking, I was scanning the list of people attending and trying to get a sense of the institutions that are represented here. I don't know all of these names, but I know some of them. And I have a couple of thoughts to add to this. So one is that if you are at a large university or academic medical center, it's likely that your pre-award support office has some kind of checklist that you can work from.
Yes.
The earlier you contact them, the better. Not everyone on this list. I know at least one name on this list of somebody who's at a much smaller organization. And you may not even have a pre-award support office that you work with. And if that's the case, there are lists online that are readily available. You can look them up and get a spreadsheet or a checklist that other organizations use so that you can begin to develop your own process around this. If you're the one who does your own upload, some small organizations, that's how it works, like
Hmm.
or 15 organizations, that kind of thing. I want to talk a little bit just because I'm looking at our list and I know we have academic medical centers represented here and at least one university that has a lot of technology, tech transfer type activities at their campus. So I wanted to talk a little bit more about that. And I'm speaking off the top of my head, so David, you're going to have to help me with.
Sure, sure.
But my recollection is that for IRB, you do not need to have your IRB approval in place at time of submission. Is that accurate?
That is accurate, but again, we did have a pre-submission process
Yeah.
to, because if you have a protocol, what is funding that protocol will hopefully be the award for this grant. There needs to be a tie, there needs to be an assessment that the science in your grant, yes, does match the science in this protocol. And that stuff happens beforehand, at
Mhm.
least in this institution where I was at. Um, so, that again, you may not need to contact IRB at all beforehand, but just be sure as to what you need to alert the officials to.
Yeah. And I will point out that NIH's requirements often differ from an organization's requirements. So, for example, NIH doesn't require you, for example, to have a faculty position to put in a grant
No.
application. Your organization might. In fact, they probably do. So, you want to check to see what the requirements are at your organization as well, because even though NIH will not require you to have the IRB in place before you apply, your organization may have some rules about that. So let's talk a little bit about tech transfer, the technology office, and then I also want to talk a little bit about budgets, particularly when there are subcontracts,
Mhm.
because that's another thing that I think trips people up. And signatories, that's the other one that because I have a really good example of that one. But the tech transfer piece, the technology piece. So I know for at least I recognize some of the names on our list of attendees. Some of these folks are at a large state university that has a really robust tech transfer machinery in place. Even if you are, so if you are at a place like that, if you're lucky enough to be at a place like that, contact your RD office to figure out who to be in touch with
Yes.
concerning the requirements that are needed for your application. That is something where your agreements have to be in place, I think, before you put your application in. Is that accurate? I think that's accurate.
Yeah, they would at least want to, submit a patent if there is some sort of risk that this information is going out,
Yeah.
in your grant. Yes.
Yeah, and
So,
particularly if you're working with another organization and there are questions about intellectual property, all of that should
correct.
be dealt with before. This is something that does have to be dealt with before you put the application in.
Yeah,
Um,
and Meg, just to make a point, because you mentioned research development RD offices, when I ran a funding development team at my institution, we did have such a checklist, both a checklist for the specific application, but also a checklist as to who do I contact at tech transfer?
yeah,
Who is the biosafety officer?
yes.
So there may be some central office for a small university, like you say, maybe the department administrator
Yeah.
has all of this information.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and for those, because when I look at the list, there are also some people who are like RD pre-award folks here, some of the names that I recognize. If your office doesn't offer these sorts of resources, these are the kinds of resources you may want to build for your applicant.
Yes.
So, in addition to a list of places where people, contacts for other offices and resources on campus, you may also want to build, for example, a repository of sample language. So samples of a facility section or sample of a successful IRB or human subjects form or whatever, so that
Yes.
applicants can look at those samples. Um, let's talk a little bit about budgets, because I think this can be a rate limiting step for a lot of people, particularly if you have subcontracts. Oh my God, that is such the rate limiting step on a lot of applications. Anytime you need information from not just others on the team, but people on different campuses and different universities, that's going to be your rate limiting step to submission. So do you want to talk a little bit about the need for dealing with budgets on subcontracts early?
Yes, certainly. So again, these processes may be different depending on where you are. Um, Subcontracts at my institution, the negotiation for them went through the central grants office. Is something, are you as the PI the one tasked with pulling things together from other offices, or do you have an administrative person in the department or the central office who will collect the contact information from, say, Weill Cornell or something like that, know who their counterparts are over there, and then you need to make clear as the PI, with some communication for the PI at the subcontracting institute, what is the expected dollar amount that this group is getting and that we are getting here? Because that bucket is needed in order to carve out, salaries and all of the other aspects that go into a budget for each institution. And that is a different indirect cost rate. That's a different fringe benefit rate. All of that needs to be prepared at that other institution and then incorporated into your grant. None of this stuff can be done, immediately. There's a lot of negotiation, there's a lot of offices. And also, please be aware, and Meg, maybe you were going to mention this, about what is the limit for the budget for a particular funding opportunity, because you
Right,
need to
right.
be able to pull out all that's required at all of your subcontracting institutes and still come down to the allowed total.
Yeah. Or get permission to exceed it if you have a good reason to exceed it, but you need that permission ahead of time to exceed the cap. So, and I think it's 500K per year on an R01.
It's 500K, and I believe you have to do that. You have to get it 6 weeks ahead of the deadline. So we always suggested contacting the program officer 8 weeks ahead. And that was part of our checklist too.
Yeah. Yeah, I would say that's a minimum. And actually, I had somebody today who is exceeding the cap by a lot on his R01, and he emailed me today to say, I got approval. So,
Yes,
and
yes, please get
his RD
approval.
is his RD is on the call. So hooray for him. So anyway, the other thing that I well, and just before we wrap up on budgets, one mistake that I've seen people make more than once is that sometimes there are requirements in a specific NOFO that say that, for example, the PI, let's say it's a cooperative agreement, and part of the NOFO is that the PI needs to fly into NIH
Mm,
annually to attend a meeting of the PIs in this cooperative network, and you
mhm.
budgeted for that.
Yes,
You're
exactly.
paying for that out of your own pocket then. So, like, you need to read the NOFO and make sure that whatever's required in the NOFO is in the budget as well. I've seen people make that mistake many times.
Yeah.
And then I'll just wrap up by talking about signatories before we get to. I have two questions that were mailed in that we can cover, and please do, people, there, put your questions in the Q&A box. But I'll tell you one story about the most hair-raising signature question I ever had to deal with in my career. Early in my career, I was the lead writer on a team for $100 million HRSA grant. It was at the time the largest construction grant in university history, and ultimately was successful, which is how I built my career. But that's another story. The day we had to upload, we didn't have the signature from the governor. And this was literally 4:55 local time, where everybody was calling the governor's office. And this was, I think, thousands of hours of person hours on this grant application. You can imagine. I mean, this application
I'm
was
getting nervous just hearing this.
I mean, whatever gray hair I have is from that application. So yeah, that is the rate limiting step. Letters of support, budgets on subcontracts, anything you need from other people is always the rate limiting step on an application.
Yeah, and while this doesn't, of course, always count for an R01, it may for very specific awards that you're going for, where you have recommendations that you don't get to see. Your recommenders write the letter, submit it to a link.
Yeah.
Make sure they know where that is, when the deadline for those things are. It's a very small thing, but that can really trip you up.
Yeah. So we do have a question, and I don't know the answer to it, so I'm going to see if David does. How important are certificates of confidentiality to be in place before you submit a grant? These can take a while.
Wow. Okay, that's a good question. It really would. It sounds like there might be a consultant or some sort of non-institution person being added to this grant. Sometimes those people need to be pre-approved well ahead of time before they're going to be added into a grant application. Others, at least from an example from my institution, those people could be added in while the process of getting them institutionally approved as a consultant or as somebody who can see whatever sensitive data, that can happen afterwards, because you're, at least our thinking was, the grant is going in now, the data is not being shared yet, they're not doing any particular work at this time, so it's just a justification that you will get that signed off by the time the award is processed.
So she has a clarifying statement. This is for to protect your subjects from the police. This is an alcohol use study.
Okay.
So this is more like, almost like an IRB question. So
this is not, it's not really one for a consultant. It's more about the patients. So then definitely I would go to your IRB.
And ask them if it's required. My guess is that it isn't. But I would double check that with your IRB office, because I don't know the answer to that. I'm not 100% sure about that one. So all right. So, and I had two mail-in questions, and one of them, I'm pretty sure I didn't cover this in the last one, so I'm going to read this one. I just got information about an R35 mechanism, and actually, I am presenting on R35 next time in 2 weeks. So I'll be doing an overview of the 4 different institutes that sponsor R35 at NIH and the differences between them. Hers is the R35 at NIGMS, which is by far the biggest of the 4. So she would like to submit an application. However, the application format is completely different, right? It's like a 6-page narrative. It's a very different kind of thing. I need help with the section overview of future research plans. That's the only one you need help with. You're already doing great. Because most people are like, I don't know how to write this thing at all. It's like an essay, you know. Where can I find information or samples for this section? So NIGMS has a gorgeous, I'm going to drop it in the chat in case it's relevant for anybody, but they have a gorgeous website that sadly does not have any samples in it, but it has lots of other stuff. So I'm just going to put that in there. It's
For the
got
Mira Awards, yeah.
yes, yep. So it's specifically the GMS one. So they have FAQs, they have a video, they have a decision tree, they have all kinds of stuff in there, but they don't have a sample. And I could not find a sample at the others either through centrally at NIH or with the other 3 institutes that sponsored the R35. So my suggestion with this and with any other mechanism where you would like to lay eyeballs on an application is to go to your pre-award support office and ask them for a sample. So typically they would have to ask permission of the PI to let you see it, or if you know somebody who submitted one recently, particularly if they were successful, ask if you can see it.
Yeah.
I'm not a fan of requesting applications through the Freedom of Information Act. I don't know how you feel about that. Like typically, you know, NIH is paid out of taxpayer dollars, and technically anything in NIH can be viewed by taxpayers through the Freedom of Information Act or FOIA. I'm not a fan of contacting NIH and forcing them to divulge an application to you through FOIA. I think that's a great way to make enemies. So just ask a colleague or a pre-award support.
And very quickly, because of what you're saying, when you ask NIH to give this grant, they go back to the PI so that they can remove any proprietary information. And so if you could just know the PI, you know, find through your network who knows, and ask it that way. And then, like you said, Meg, for the funding development team in my institution, we built a library of grants. And even if somebody wasn't willing, for example, to share one particular mechanism, we would know who, and then be able to go to them and say, Dr. So-and-so, would you share this?
Yeah.
And one last thing for the Mira. I'm sorry, tell me to stop if you have
no, it's all
one
good.
last thing for the Mira. Do make sure, and you may have already done your due diligence about this, what existing grants you will need to relinquish and what the monies that you know are potential for the Mira are. Make sure that you're not giving up more money than you could possibly be getting in.
That's a great point, David. Yeah, that is a really good point.
Because when we had a choice between an NIGMS Mira or an NCI OIA, Outstanding Investigator Award, we shifted people to the OIA because there, the monies you get are more, even as you relinquish other grants.
That's really good information. And the NCI R35 is a little different than the GMS one. So, you know, just to be aware that they're different lengths of time, and I think the awards are different amounts, but we'll get into, I'm getting ahead of myself because that's going to be the next, in 2 weeks, I'll be presenting on that. But yeah, that's a really good point. So anyway, yeah, and also the point about building a library of language, because sometimes the other thing is, even if you can't, as an RD person or a pre-award support person, even if you can't get an applicant to be willing to share the entire application, sometimes they're willing to share a piece of it. So, for example, you could have a library that consists of one person's RCR on their K application and another person's candidate section and another person, you know, like, so you can cobble it together, which is basically how I do my trainings, because I can't divulge an entire application that's still active, but my clients will allow me to show little pieces. So a piece of this one and a piece of that one, like that. So. Okay, and I'm just going to quickly read through this last one. We're just about at time. I submitted my R21 grant as a PI last February at NCI. I recently received the summary statement with several positive comments and got a good impact score, 29, percentile 13%. I have ESI status until February 2024, and could get an extension. I'm also a new investigator. As this is an R21, I'm wondering if these statuses could help my situation. And the short answer is nope. ESI has nothing to do with R21. You won't get a funding advantage, ESI funding advantage, nor will you lose your ESI status if you get an R21. ESI has nothing to do with R21 at all. So the other part is I emailed the program officer and he said that unfortunately the pay line is the 9th percentile. They'll still consider it an FY24. Do you have suggestions in my situation for what to ask on the call with the program officer? My suggestion is to watch my resubmission scores because I have a whole checklist on there of of the decision-making process for resubmitting and what to ask a program officer on that call and how to read the summary statements and come to decisions about it. So that's kind of the short answer is R21 doesn't have an ESI advantage at all. And if you're not sure about the process or decision-making around resubmissions, I would just suggest watching. Everybody on this call has access to it for free, the Master the Resubmissions course, because everybody on the call is part of an organizational membership. So any other parting comments, David? I think we're just about at time.
Yeah, I mean, so much to talk about for R35. I'm so excited you're doing a session on that.
Well, feel free to attend in 2 weeks, and then you could jump in too.
Yeah, my office handled all the R35s, so yeah,
Really,
it's exciting. Yeah,
they're confusing because they're so different for each of the institutes that sponsor them. So,
yeah,
it's part of the reason I decided on that topic because I needed to do research to clarify.
yeah,
It's how I wind up doing most of my stuff. So.
yeah. And as your correspondent said, you're not talking about a project; you're talking about the future direction of your lab.
Exactly. Right. Yeah. All right. So I think that's it for today. And I want to thank David for attending. As always, we're
Thanks for
open
having me.
to you. And as I said, on September 6th, I'll be presenting on R35, but then on the 20th, David will be back to talk about admin tasks as you prepare to submit. So we'll look forward to seeing you in a few weeks, David. And
Very
everybody
good.
have a great week, and we'll see you in 2 weeks. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.